My best friend lived with us. Then I found them together. I couldn't believe my eyes. In the dim light, I saw her hands on his shoulders. Their faces were too close. A quiet whisper froze time. This should never have happened. My legs were numb, but my heart was pounding so loudly it felt like they would hear it. The light went out suddenly. As the living room plunged into darkness, I heard muffled laughter from the next room. It was an ordinary evening in our house, but something made my heart race. I moved closer to the door. No, it couldn't be my best friend, Jason, but the laugh was his. My wife, Sarah, always said Jason was part of our family. He moved in with us a few months ago after his divorce, and I was happy to help him get back on his feet. He and Sarah always got along well, and I never saw a problem with it. Until now, standing in front of the door, I felt a wave of anxiety. It's just my imagination, I tried to convince myself. But then I heard the whisper break into soft, almost intimate laughter. My hands gripped the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Something inside me screamed, "Stop! You don't need to know the truth yet." Suddenly, the door opened slightly. Sarah was standing next to Jason, her hands on his shoulders. Their gazes met in a way I had never seen before. They didn't notice me. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing when she whispered softly, "You know this should never have happened?" At that moment, I stepped back without making a sound. I didn't know if it was just a careless gesture or if I had witnessed something more. But one thing was clear. My life would never be the same again. I didn't know what to do next. Confrontation felt too risky since I had no proof, only a feeling and one small scene that I might have misinterpreted. So, I decided to watch and wait. The next morning, I intentionally stayed home, saying I would work remotely. Sarah seemed calm, even cheerful, but I noticed small changes in her behavior. When Jason walked into the kitchen, their eyes met, and a quick, almost invisible smile passed between them. I wouldn't have paid attention to it if not for last night. At lunch, Sarah suddenly said she needed to go to the store. Jason offered to drive her. I silently watched as they left together. My head was spinning with thoughts. What if it's just my paranoia? But something inside me insisted, you need to know the truth. When they returned, I noticed a new detail. In the bag Sarah brought back was an item I had only seen in perfume ads before. It wasn't hers. Quietly, I pulled the receipt from the bag when they left the room. There were 2 perfumes on it, one of them a men's fragrance. This made me even more suspicious. The next day, I found Sarah's phone on the kitchen counter while she was in another room. My heart raced as I opened her messages. There was only a short text, "See you after lunch?" The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it. It was Jason's. I decided not to rush and tried to stay as calm as possible. I needed to find out if there was really something between them or if it was just my imagination. To do this, I planned to create situations that might reveal the truth. That evening, I told Sarah I had urgent work at the office and would be home late. In reality, I stayed in my car near the house, waiting to see if anything unusual happened. The kitchen light was on, and I saw them sitting together at the table, laughing. My suspicion deepened. The next day, I came home earlier than I said I would and found them in the living room. Sarah looked up at me with unexpected anxiety. "Oh, you're home already?" she asked, smiling nervously. "Yeah, work finished early," I replied. studying her face intently. Jason got up from the couch and quickly left the room under the pretense of a phone call. Their behavior was becoming increasingly suspicious. I didn't say anything, but I decided to take more decisive action. The next time, I left a voice recorder in the living room, telling them I was going to the store. When I returned and listened to the recording, the conversation I heard left no room for doubt. "He's starting to suspect something," Sarah said. "Don't worry, I'll handle it," Jason replied. After recording their conversation, I no longer had any doubts. Something was happening, and they were hiding it from me. But confronting them directly now could lead to denials or lies. I needed a trap that would force their lies into the open. That evening, I told them I had an urgent business trip and wouldn't be back until the next day. Sarah didn't even ask for details. She just nodded and said she had prepared dinner for me. I could see in her eyes that she was planning something. I left the house, but an hour later, I returned quietly, leaving my car far from the driveway. Ensuring the kitchen light was still on, I approached the window, hiding in the shadows. At first, everything seemed normal. Sarah was sitting at the table. But then I saw Jason enter the room, sit beside her, and they began discussing something in hushed tones. I turned on my phone to record everything I could hear. Their conversation was tense. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah said, lowering her head. "He hasn't figured it out." "If you don't tell him, I will," Jason replied, his voice tinged with anger. My hands were trembling. This was the moment of truth. I entered the house, opening the door as quietly as I could. Their voices grew louder. I walked into the kitchen, and they didn't even notice me at first. "What can't you keep doing?" I asked coldly, cutting into their conversation. Sarah froze, and Jason stood up, looking stunned. "This isn't what you think," Sarah began, but her voice was shaking. I took out my phone and showed them the recording. They had nothing more to say. Their faces said it all. Sarah froze like a statue. Panic was written all over her face. Jason looked bewildered, but tried to maintain his composure. The silence in the room stretched on, feeling like an eternity as I waited for one of them to say something. Finally, Sarah lowered her head and whispered, "It's not what it looks like. It happened only once. I don't know how to explain it, but—" Her voice broke as she covered her face with her hands. My fingers gripped the phone so tightly I could feel the metal heating up in my palm. "Only once." I barely restrained my anger. "Do you seriously think that's enough to justify any of this?" Jason tried to interject. "Listen, man, it was a mistake. We both knew it was wrong. It won't happen again. Do you even understand what you've done?" I shouted at him. "You came into my home, into my family, and you betrayed me?" Sarah lifted her head. Her eyes filled with tears. "It was my fault. He didn't want this. I was weak. You were always working, and I felt so alone. But I swear, I love only you." Her words hit like a heavy stone. My heart was torn between rage and despair. I looked at them, trying to find even a shred of truth in their eyes. I placed the phone on the table. "You both decided to destroy everything. Now tell me, how are you going to fix it?" Sarah stepped closer, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. "Please, give me a chance to make this right. I'll do anything for you to forgive me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. The pain and betrayal overshadowed any words I could muster. I couldn't find the words to describe how I felt. All that remained was the weight of betrayal, which made me take a step back. "I don't know what to do about this," I said, retreating toward the kitchen door. "I need to be alone." Sarah started crying. She reached out as if she wanted to stop me, but I was already gone. I left the house without a clear plan, only wanting to escape the chaos. Their betrayal felt unreal, but I knew I had to find a way to deal with it. I decided to spend the night at a hotel. That evening, I stared at our wedding photo on my phone. Every detail in the picture reminded me of the love we once shared, but now those memories felt bitter. Sarah called me several times, but I didn't answer. I needed time. The next morning, I received a message from her. "I know I've destroyed your trust, but I'm begging you, give me a chance to make things right. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me how I can fix this." I didn't reply immediately. Thoughts of divorce crossed my mind for the first time, but something held me back. Love and hatred were battling inside me. At that moment, I realized I needed time to sort myself out. That day, I returned home, but we didn't speak. I slept in the guest room. The tension between us was unbearable. Sarah tried to start a conversation, but I avoided her. The first days after I came back were tense and almost unbearable. We were silent, like two strangers accidentally living under the same roof. Sarah made several attempts to talk to me, but I couldn't even look her in the eye. The feeling of betrayal still burned inside me. One evening, as I sat in the guest room, she knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice hesitant, almost timid. I nodded without looking up from the book I was pretending to read. She sat on the edge of the bed, nervously fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I've made an appointment with a therapist," she said suddenly. "I know it's not enough, but I want to fix what I've done." I didn't reply right away. Her words sounded sincere, but my heart felt like shattered glass. Finally, I asked, "Why? Why did you do it?" Sarah looked at me, her eyes glistening with tears. "I have no excuses. I was lonely. You were always busy with work. Jason became someone who was always there, and I got confused. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving you." Those words only made me angrier. "Loving me? Do you even realize how ridiculous that sounds?" She fell silent, clenching her hands as if afraid I would leave. "I'm willing to fight for us. I know you need time, but I love you, and I'll prove it." The next day, Sarah began taking action. She made breakfast and left a note on the table. "It's important to me that you feel I'm here for you. I know this won't restore your trust, but I'll try every day. Tell me how I can make things right." Her attempts were genuine, but I remained cold. Hatred and love mixed inside me, creating a volatile cocktail that gave me no peace. I couldn't decide if I could ever forgive her. At the same time, I noticed Sarah had started going to therapy. She would come home exhausted, but with a newfound determination. One evening, she suggested, "Maybe you should go too? I know you're hurting, and you need someone to talk to." Her suggestion felt logical. Perhaps I could understand myself before making any final decisions. Sarah also avoided any contact with Jason. He didn't show up at our house, and she never mentioned him. That gave me some comfort, but I wasn't sure if it was just part of her plan to regain my trust. My next step was accepting her suggestion. I scheduled a therapy session. The first session allowed me to release all the anger and pain I had been holding inside. The therapist told me that while I couldn't ignore the pain, it was important to figure out what I wanted from the relationship. Sarah was waiting for me at home after my session. She looked at me with hope in her eyes, but I gave her no answer. This was her test. She needed to prove that her words were sincere and not just empty promises. It had no return address. Inside was a small sheet of paper with the following written on it. If you think you know the truth, you're very wrong. Want more? Call. I held the letter in my hands, examining every detail. The black letters on the white sheet looked ominously simple. If you think you know the truth, you're very wrong. Want more? Call. I walked into the kitchen, where Sarah was making dinner. She turned to me as I placed the letter on the table. What is this? I asked coldly, keeping my eyes fixed on her. She flinched as she looked at the sheet. Her face turned pale. I don't know where this came from, she replied in a trembling voice. Really? I held up the letter. Are you telling me you have no idea who could have sent this? Sarah lowered her head, looking frightened. Maybe it's some kind of mistake. Or maybe Jason. But I don't know why. I haven't spoken to him. You know that? Her words sounded sincere, but my suspicions only deepened. If it's a mistake, then why did I get this letter? If you're telling the truth, then why does it hint that there's something I don't know? She couldn't find an answer. I silently watched her nervously clutch the edge of her apron. You have one chance to tell me everything, I warned, leaning in closer. If I find out something from someone else again, it'll be the end. Sarah raised her head, her eyes brimming with tears. I've told you everything. Nothing else happened, I swear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in my head, but the letter left me with so many questions. If not her, then who? And why now? The next morning, I decided to try to find some answers. I took the letter and went to a friend who worked in law enforcement. He promised to look into the phone number written on it. That evening, I got a call from him. The number is registered to someone named Marcus Hale, he said. But here's the strange part. This person recently reported their phone stolen. This only heightened my suspicions. The number was a front, but I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I decided to call. When I did, a woman's voice answered on the other end. I knew you'd call. If you want to know the truth, meet me tomorrow at 8 p.m. at the cafe on Brook Street. Don't be late. I felt a chill run down my spine. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. After the call, I felt even more confused. The woman's voice on the other end was familiar, but I couldn't figure out from where. Who was she? And why had she decided to interfere in my life now? I wanted answers, but at the same time, I knew I couldn't dive into this emotionally unprepared. That evening, I hid the letter and phone in the drawer of my desk, hoping to keep this between myself and the mysterious caller. But Sarah was more observant than I expected. In the morning, while I was in the shower, she found the letter. When I returned to the bedroom, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding it in her hands. Her face was tense, and tears glistened in her eyes. "What does this mean?" she asked, showing me the letter. Her voice trembled, and there was fear in it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I sighed, trying to come up with an answer. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you," I said, looking directly into her eyes. She turned away as if my words had struck her. I swear I've told you everything. I have nothing left to hide. Then explain why someone sent me a letter saying I know nothing, I replied sharply. If you're being honest, why is this happening? Sarah was silent. She looked as if she wanted to say something but was too afraid. Maybe it's someone from Jason's past, she finally whispered. I don't know. But if this is important, we need to figure it out together. Her words caught me off guard. Sarah wanted to go with me to the meeting, and it made me hesitate. Could her determination be proof of her innocence? Or was this just another game? Sarah stayed home, clearly anxious. She tried to act calm, but I noticed her hands trembling as she prepared lunch. Her entire body betrayed her fear. In the evening, as I was getting ready to leave for the meeting, she approached me. I'm going with you, she said. I looked at her carefully. If you're coming, I want honesty. No false explanations. If anyone reveals something you've been hiding, this will be the end, I warned. She nodded, and we left together. When we entered the cafe, there was already a woman sitting there in dark sunglasses and a hat. She raised her head, and my heart froze. It was one of Sarah's acquaintances, a person she used to spend a lot of time with, but who had suddenly disappeared from our lives a few months ago. The woman looked directly at Sarah and said, "You didn't tell him, did you?" Sarah froze like a statue, and I realized I was only steps away from uncovering a new truth that could destroy everything once and for all. The woman removed her sunglasses and looked straight at me. Her eyes were filled with determination. She took a sip of her coffee, slowly, and finally said, "Sit down. We need to talk." Sarah nervously slid into the seat next to me. She looked like she wanted to flee. I watched her every move closely. "So, you decided not to tell him?" the woman asked Sarah again. "Tell me what?" I cut in sharply. Sarah didn't answer. Her face was pale, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. The woman sighed and turned to me. "Your wife hasn't been honest with you. What happened with Jason is just the tip of the iceberg. She thinks you'll never find out, but I can't let her keep playing her games." "Speak plainly," I demanded. "What do you know?" The woman leaned forward and whispered, "Sarah had an affair with Jason long before he moved in with you, and it lasted much longer than she told you." Sarah's head shot up, her face turning red with either anger or shame. "That's not true," she shouted. "You're making this up." "Making it up?" the woman smiled. "I have messages she sent to Jason. I can show them to you." My heart clenched again. I looked at Sarah. "You told me it happened only once. Is that true?" Sarah tried to say something, but her words sounded unconvincing. "It was a mistake, but it only happened once. She just wants to ruin us. Can't you see that?" The woman pulled out her phone and opened the gallery. She showed me several screenshots of messages. On the screen, I saw Sarah's familiar number. "I miss you. Why can't we be together?" Another text. "He doesn't suspect anything. Everything will be fine." I felt the ground fall out from under me. Everything Sarah had told me before now felt like a lie. "And that's not all," the woman added. She knew it was wrong, but she kept doing it anyway. "Jason confessed it to me himself when we met a few months ago." Her gaze was fixed on the floor. "Is it true?" I asked, directing the question at her. I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. "It was before he moved in, but I didn't want to ruin our marriage. I swear, I wanted to stop it. I stayed silent. It was hard even to breathe. I stood up from the table, ignoring Sarah's pleas for me to stay. The woman looked at me with an expression of sympathy. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked at both of them and answered, "I'll do what I should have done a long time ago." I walked out of the cafe, leaving them behind. But what exactly was I supposed to do? That question still gnawed at me. As I stepped out of the cafe, the cold evening wind hit my face, but it was nothing compared to the chill I felt inside. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. Every word, every message I had just seen played in my mind like a broken record. Sarah came home later. I heard the door close and her slow, cautious footsteps as she walked into the kitchen. It was as if she was afraid even to breathe. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching her shadow move under the dim light of the hallway. "We need to talk." Her voice broke the silence, but I didn't respond. She stepped into the living room and saw me. She looked exhausted. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red from crying. "I know you hate me right now," she whispered, sitting at the edge of the couch. "But please, hear me out." "Hate you?" My voice sounded hollow. "No, Sarah. I feel like I don't know you at all." She leaned in closer, but I stood up to keep my distance. "I told you I needed time. Now I see what I meant. Tomorrow, I'm leaving." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "Leaving? Where?" "Far away from all of this. I need to figure out who I am in all of this and whether you're even in my future," I said, looking her straight in the eyes. "You had a chance to tell the truth, but you chose to lie. Now it's hard even to think about you being near me." Sarah began to cry. She reached out, but I stepped back. "You need to understand. Right now, I'm not your husband. I'm just the man you betrayed," I said, heading to the guest room. The next morning, I packed my things. Sarah stood by the door as I left. Her eyes begged me to stay, but I didn't even stop to say goodbye. My new temporary home became a small hotel room on the other side of town. It wasn't quite an escape, more like an attempt to find some peace in the chaos. I didn't want to see her face or hear her voice, but that didn't mean I could forget her. One evening, lying on the bed, I heard my phone vibrate. It was a message from her. "Please let me explain. I'll do anything. Just come back." I didn't reply. The next day, another message came. "I've started therapy. I'm beginning to understand why this happened, but I can't do this without you." Her words touched something deep inside me, but the pain and anger were still stronger. I decided not to respond. It was Jason. "Hey," his voice sounded nervous. "We need to talk." I froze. My body tensed. "There's nothing for us to talk about," I replied coldly. "No, you don't understand," he insisted. "There's something you need to know. I made a mistake, but it's not what you think." It's too late for excuses. I was about to hang up, but his next words stopped me. "She lied to you about more than just us. You deserve to know everything," he said. His words made me pause. What was Sarah hiding? If her betrayal was just part of the story, what else was waiting for me? I decided to meet him, but this time it would be on my terms. I needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. I agreed to meet Jason. I figured it was better to hear whatever he had to say than to keep living in uncertainty. We arranged to meet at a bar near my temporary residence. His voice during the call was tense, but full of promises to reveal the truth. When I entered the bar, he was already waiting, sitting at a table in the corner. His face looked haggard, but his eyes still held the same confident expression I knew so well. "You came," he said as I sat down across from him. "Don't abuse that," I replied coldly. "Just tell me what you wanted to say." He nervously took a sip of his beer and sighed. "Look, what happened between me and Sarah, it was a mistake, I know. But I need you to understand, I never intended to lie to you." "You've said that already," I interrupted. "What else do you have to add?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Sarah is keeping secrets you wouldn't even imagine. But, you know, I've always had a talent for spotting when people lie." His words seemed strange, but I stayed focused. "Go on," I said, keeping my emotions in check. "I wanted you to find out the truth. But it seems like you won't be hearing it from me," he said abruptly, standing up. I stood up too. "You're hiding something again? Don't play games with me, Jason." He smiled, but there was no joy in his eyes. "I've already played, and it seems I've won more than you think," he said, his words the final straw. I clenched my fists but held back from hitting him. This was all part of his game, and I realized he was enjoying getting under my skin. Jason walked out of the bar, leaving me with even more questions tormenting me. What did he mean? What had he won? On the table was an envelope left by the receptionist. Inside was a photo. In the picture, I saw Jason and Sarah in his apartment, embracing, smiling. The date on the photo showed it was taken 2 weeks ago, when she swore to me she had cut all ties with him. My hands trembled. Anger rose inside me like a volcano ready to erupt. At the bottom of the photo was a caption: "She'll always be mine, and you'll never change that." I picked up my phone and called Sarah. Her voice sounded groggy, as if she had just woken up. "We need to talk," I said, trying to keep my anger in check. "What happened?" she asked. "I know you're still seeing him," I said coldly. "Tomorrow, you'll explain everything. And this will be your last chance." The next day, I woke up earlier than usual. My entire plan required steely composure, but I was ready. Jason and Sarah could no longer manipulate me separately. I decided to bring them together and settle everything once and for all. I called Jason, using the same cold tone I had left him with during our last conversation. "We need to meet. I want to know the whole truth, and you'll tell me." But this time, with Sarah there too. His pause on the other end lasted a few seconds before he replied, "Fine, but remember, I'm not the only one hiding something." I felt anger rise again, but I suppressed it. Today wasn't the time for emotions. We met in my hotel room. Sarah arrived first. She was quiet and looked drained. "What is all this about?" she asked, sitting down on a chair near the table. "We'll wait for Jason, and then you'll find out," I replied. She tried to start a conversation, but I cut off all her attempts with short answers. When Jason arrived, the tension in the room became unbearable. He walked in, shot a brief glance at Sarah, and immediately turned his attention to me. "All right, let's get started," he said, sitting across from her. "You start," I said, staring at him with a cold expression. "Tell me everything you've been hiding." Jason smirked bitterly. "You want the truth? Fine. You should know your wife hasn't only been lying to you about me." Sarah snapped her head toward him. "Shut up," she exclaimed, her voice breaking into a high pitch. "What does that mean?" I asked, clenching my fists. "It means she had another affair before me," Jason said, clearly enjoying the shock that registered on my face. "I found out about it by accident when we started, well, you know." "That's a lie," Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. "He just wants to destroy us for good." "A lie." Jason lifted his phone and opened a message. "And these texts? I miss our evenings together. Are those lies too?" Sarah covered her face with her hands, unable to say anything. "Who was it?" I asked, looking at her coldly. "Who was before him?" She stayed silent. The seconds of silence felt like an eternity. Finally, she whispered, "It was before us, before our wedding. He was just a fling. I thought it was over." My thoughts were chaos. Lie after lie, secret after secret. I turned to Jason. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. He smiled. "Because I wanted you to know. You were never her first." Sarah began to cry. She tried to explain something, but her words were lost in a torrent of tears. I stood up. "You both destroyed everything," I said, looking at them. "But the worst part is, you made me doubt myself." My head was overwhelmed with questions. I needed to decide whether it was even worth trying to salvage anything from this chaos, or finally sever all ties and start fresh. As I left the room, my thoughts swirled like a storm. I walked aimlessly down the street, trying to find some clarity amidst the emotional confusion. All I knew was that staying in this state of uncertainty was impossible. I had to make a decision that would allow me to move forward, whether it was with her or without her. I returned to the hotel only in the evening. My phone showed several missed calls from Sarah, but I ignored them. The next morning, she was waiting for me outside the hotel. She looked exhausted but determined. "I need to talk to you," she said as I approached. "You had enough time to explain everything," I replied coldly. She locked her gaze on mine. "I know you have every right to hate me, but please, give me a chance to make things right." I sighed, gesturing for her to come inside. We went up to my room, and I gave her the floor. "Speak, but if you tell even one lie, this will be the end," I warned. Sarah began to talk, her words filled with pain and remorse. She explained how her connection with Jason started long ago, during a time when she felt vulnerable. How over time, it became a mistake she couldn't escape. She admitted to deceiving me, but emphasized that she wanted to fix everything. "I've started therapy," she said. "I know I've destroyed everything, but I'm willing to fight for our marriage." I listened carefully but didn't reveal what I was thinking. When she finished, I got up and walked to the window. "If you truly want to fix this, it will be on my terms," I said after a pause. "I'll do whatever it takes," she replied, her voice trembling. "First, you will never see Jason again," I said, still looking away. "And not because I'm demanding it, but because it's the only way you'll regain even a shred of my trust." "Okay," she whispered. "Second, you'll continue therapy, but I want to know how it's going. I'm also willing to go to therapy to figure out if it's even worth continuing this relationship. But if any of your actions seem suspicious to me, it's over." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And lastly," I turned to face her, "you will be honest with me about everything from now on? No exceptions." Sarah looked up at me, her eyes filled with hope. "I promise," she said. The following weeks were challenging. We started attending therapy both separately and together. The sessions helped, but the wounds were still fresh. Sarah worked hard to rebuild my trust, but every small thing seemed like a potential threat. One evening, when I came home from work, she was waiting with dinner and a packet of documents. "These are my therapy notes," she said. "I know you have doubts, so I want you to see how hard I'm trying to change." Her openness surprised me. It was a step forward, but was it enough to forgive her? It contained just one sentence. "Do you really think it's over?" The next morning, after receiving the message, I woke up with the feeling that the past was catching up to us again. That short, cryptic text made me think this wasn't the end. I decided not to show it to Sarah just yet. She had only just begun to recover, and I didn't want to create more chaos. But later that same day, chaos came knocking on our door. When I returned from work, I saw Sarah standing in the living room. In front of her was a man I had never seen before. He was tall, with a stern expression, and held an envelope in his hands. "Who's this?" I asked as I entered the room. Sarah turned to me, and I saw fear on her face. "This is Mark," she said quietly. Mark looked at me. "I think you should know. I'm not here by accident," he began. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling the tension rise. Mark pulled several photographs out of the envelope. They were of Sarah, but clearly taken a long time ago. In one photo, she was with Mark, hugging in a bar. In another, they were sitting together in a car, their poses leaving no doubt about the intimacy between them. "What does this mean?" I asked Sarah, holding the photographs. She flushed and lowered her head. "It was before we started dating," she whispered. "But why is this coming up now?" I asked sharply. Mark interrupted our conversation. "Because Sarah didn't tell you the whole truth. We were together for about a year, and when she left me, she didn't even say goodbye. She just disappeared. And now what? You've come to tell me this? Why?" My patience was wearing thin. "Because I want to warn you," he said. "If she left me so easily, how can you be sure she won't do the same to you?" Sarah began to cry, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. That evening, Mark left, leaving us in tense silence. Sarah tried to explain that her relationship with him had ended long before we met, and that it didn't matter to us now. "This doesn't concern me," I said sharply. "This man shows up at my house, tells me you've been dishonest, and you think it's irrelevant?" "I didn't want this to resurface," she replied, tears in her eyes. "It was part of my past, and I wanted to leave it there." "But your past keeps haunting us," I said. "And every time I think I'm starting to trust you, another ghost shows up." I stared at the photo I had received for a long time. Mark, Jason, and an unfamiliar man. Their poses were friendly, but something in their expressions made me uneasy. The caption under the photo felt like a challenge. "Are you ready to learn the whole truth?" I decided not to show this to Sarah. She was already too broken, and every new detail felt like a threat to destroy us completely. But this time, I knew I had to act. The next day, I tried to track down the man from the photo. His face seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I had seen him before. I reached out to a friend in law enforcement and asked him to look into the photo. A few hours later, he called me back. "His name is Evan Reed," my friend said. He recently came back to town after spending a few years in prison. Charges of financial fraud, but the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence, my friend replied. Evan Reed. Why was he with Jason and Mark? And why did this photo come to me now? I decided not to delay and drove to the address my friend had found in the database. It was a small bar in a rundown part of town. When I entered, I saw Evan sitting at a table. He was wearing the same leather jacket as in the photo. Finally, he said, noticing me. His smile was anything but friendly. I knew you'd come. What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my anger in check. Evan shook his head. It's not about what I want. It's about what you need to know. He gestured for me to sit down. I slowly took a seat across from him. Sarah didn't tell you everything, did she? He began. You know, when I met her, she already had a lot of secrets. But her ability to convince people of her innocence always fascinated me. What are you getting at? I asked, clenching my fists. Evan pulled out his phone and showed me another photo. In it, Sarah looked much younger. She was holding a bundle of cash, standing next to Evan and several other men. Did you know we were partners? She helped me with some financial transactions. A very successful girl until things went sideways, he said with a hint of sarcasm. Was this a business? Fraud? I asked, trying to piece it all together. Fraud, he said bluntly. But, you know, I don't hold a grudge against her. She made her choice and walked away. It's just a shame that choice has brought her back to me. What are you trying to say? I asked, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. Evan leaned in closer and whispered, She needs to tell you what that deal was about. If she doesn't, I will. And this time, the consequences will be real. I returned home in a state of emotional chaos. Sarah was waiting for me at the door. Her face looked anxious. We need to talk, I said as I walked inside. I know, she replied. She handed me her phone. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. I warned you. It's time to tell him the whole truth, or I will. Sarah sat across from me, her hands clutching the phone, and fear was evident in her eyes. She always had a way of portraying herself as someone fighting for her life. But this time I couldn't bring myself to trust her. What is this message? I asked coldly, pointing to the screen. I don't know who's sending this, she said, her voice trembling. Enough, Sarah. I raised my voice. You've lied to me enough times. If you want me to stay, tell me the whole truth. Otherwise, I'll find it myself. She remained silent, her lips quivering, but no tears fell. She looked away, and I realized I wouldn't get the truth from her tonight. Fine, I said, standing up. Then I'll find out everything myself. Where are you going? She asked, panic in her voice. Somewhere I can get answers, I replied, closing the door behind me. I told him about the latest developments and asked him to find everything he could about the connections between Sarah, Evan, and Jason. He agreed to help but warned me. This might be a dirty story, and you might hear things you won't like. It can't get any worse, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The next day, I received the first batch of information from him. Sarah and Evan had worked together on several financial schemes that left a trail of broken lives. However, one of their partners had accused Sarah of selling out the team to avoid responsibility. That partner was Jason. This revelation changed everything. I now understood why Jason had been so involved in our lives. It wasn't just about their relationship. He wanted revenge. I came home late that evening, ready for a serious conversation with Sarah. She was waiting for me in the living room, her face looking drained. "Did you find something?" she asked quietly. "I know about Evan. I know about Jason. And I know that you betrayed not just me, but everyone who trusted you," I said, staring directly into her eyes. She covered her face with her hands. "That was a long time ago," she whispered. "I tried to leave it all behind." "But you didn't," I replied sharply. "You hid it from me. You lied. You let these people into our lives." "I was afraid you'd leave if you found out," she said through tears. "I really wanted to start over." "And do you think we have a chance now?" I asked. "You've destroyed everything, Sarah." At that moment, as I was about to leave, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Evan. "Meet me tomorrow. I'll show you something that will completely change how you see her." I showed it to Sarah. She stared at the screen in horror and whispered, "Please don't go. Tomorrow will be your last chance to prove your honesty," I said. I didn't sleep that night. Evan's message burned in my mind like a flame, consuming the last remnants of trust and peace. What could he show me that would change everything? And was I ready for it? Sarah didn't try to stop me when I got ready in the morning. She just stood silently by the door, her eyes pleading with me to stay, but I felt like I had already gone too far. "I'll come back when I know the whole truth," I said before walking out. He was waiting for me at a table in the corner, his face calm, almost smug. In front of him lay a tablet and several folders. "I'm glad you came," he said as I sat down. "I think it's time you understood who you've been with all this time." "Say what you want," I replied sharply. Evan turned on the tablet and showed me a video. And it was Sarah, much younger, in a luxurious office. She was talking to a man who appeared influential. Her words were clear. "The deal will go smoothly. We'll get our money, and the rest won't matter." "This is from the time we worked together," Evan said. "But that's not the most interesting part." He fast-forwarded the video. The next frame showed Jason. He was handing Sarah a folder, and her reaction was anything but friendly. "If this gets out, you know how it will end," she said. "This is just the beginning," Jason replied. Evan stopped the video and looked at me. "She didn't just betray you. She betrayed all of us. Sarah is a master manipulator. Her connection with Jason was part of the game to save her own skin." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Everything I'd learned felt like an endless web of lies wrapping around me. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Evan smiled. "I want you to understand that Sarah was never who you thought she was. Decide for yourself what to do next." I returned home. Sarah was sitting in the kitchen, her face tense as I walked in. "Did you know this was all a game?" I asked without preamble. She looked up and saw me holding the tablet. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain?" I threw the tablet onto the table. "Your whole life is a lie. I trusted you. I built a future with you, and you used me." "No, that's not true," she screamed. "I love you. I really wanted to change everything." "But you didn't," I interrupted. "And now I see no reason to stay." I left the house, feeling the door close not just physically but emotionally as well. I realized I couldn't forgive her, even if there were remnants of feelings still inside me. Sarah's past was like a cloud that had always overshadowed our life. She chose lies, and I chose the truth. This time, I chose myself. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. It destroys. But only through the ruins can you find a path to a new life. And what about you? Could you forgive such lies if you knew the love was real? Can love exist without trust?